Welcome back to the Emerald Knight, Part 15, Molten Blood. My initial thought before I began to write this part was having it in Aranthus's perspective, following Aranthus, but then I decided to turn that around and instead of from her perspective, or instead of following her, let's get a little bit insight from the knight. You know, I thought of longer stories, a lot of novels out there that have multiple main characters, and how they often switch between the characters here and there, depending on the scene or where either character is. And I thought that would fit pretty well here, to finally get something out of the knight. Let the readers follow the knight instead. And in of that, there's a certain lack of poetry, at least initially, and I think that this part benefits from its simplicity and how it simply just relates the details that are necessary and relates the events. It helps mirror, it does something like mirror the character whom we are following. I say that now, the lack of poetry, because I'm conflicted. I say that there's a lack of poetry that benefits this part, but as I say that, I am conflicted because I do insert some poetic meaning, like representing something as something else, not necessarily like poetic symbolism, really, just like I've done before in saying like how Aranthus, like she feels all this fire, the smoke, and the stuff from within. There's a moment like that later in this part, and it works very poetically, like those moments with Aranthus, and I'm conflicted about it because, as I just said about the simplicity of it and the lack of poetry flowing through or flowing into details here and there, that it benefits in that it helps put us within the domain of the knight. It helps, it does something for their character. I'm conflicted about that part because of that, and I'm not sure whether I want to take it out because I kind of like it. But I'll try and touch on that a little later when we come upon it. Here's where Aranthus begins to start talking about memories. Talking about Almrun reminds her of being there, and we get more backstory about her aunt and the rest of the members of her family. It goes to show that even though she went through what she went through in part 14, those thoughts haven't left her at all. There's a part coming up where I make a little annotation, a little formatting with the parentheses, and it's got to do with her father and her brother. There are verbs in the sentences concerning them, and after once I get to her brother, I alter them. They're the verbs loved right here, loved, and the other one has something to do with her brother, but I fence off the D in loved, and I put the D in parentheses and have a S/S, depending on whether or not I want to go with loved or loves, because depending on which one I go with, it'll bring out, it'll allude to whether or not Aranthis really accepts that they're gone. Loved it versus loves it. And the same sort of thing to do with her brother. That being said, I would like to talk a little bit more about, on the topic of research to do with the Emerald Knight. I know that I've talked about it a little bit, and talked about how I may do some research into a certain piece of information, some subject matter like armor, like if something is in a scene that I want to communicate or express, and I have very limited knowledge of said thing, I'll see if I can pull something up about it to help it flow out more naturally, at least to some extent. However, when thinking about research for when writing a book, when I first, as I've said before, when I first started writing this, I was thinking, well, you know, it's fantasy. I'll only have to do so much research as I want to. And of course, I had to do quite a bit if I wanted to have a authentic environment, the authentic environment that I was seeking. But in any other book, perhaps, in any other sort of book, like a drama, like it's about a couple and they have a child, if the writer doesn't have much experience with children, they'll probably want to do extensive research about being a parent or having a child or things to do with raising a child. In a crime story, the writer will probably, if they don't have very much knowledge about police or detective work, they will probably want to do a lot of research, extensive research on forensic practices and so forth. If the story is set in a specific time, again, extensive research about that time and place. If it's set in a different place but in modern times, extensive research about that place, or extensive research about certain people or persons, etc. With this fantasy story, as I have it as I'm thinking of it anyway, the only research that I would seek out is more environmental than anything, or something to do with props, like armor, swords. Sure, I could do extensive research on medieval times and feudalism and things like of that nature, but largely the story is whatever I want it to be, because generally speaking, in a fantasy story, you have fantasy creatures and fantastical things that occur. And in of that, there's... I can only do about as much research as I can on extraterrestrial life forms. It's whatever the writer wishes it to be. It can be, and the fantasy story can be symbolic even, maybe to a way to comment on stuff that's going on in the writer's life, or politics, or whatever. But if it's simply just fantasy and isn't necessarily symbolic of anything, the only research in the story of itself would come from the writer's own experiences and what they want to see. It isn't really limited to needing to do extensive research on how to raise children, on a specific time frame, or a time in history, or place in history. I mean, of course, those sorts of things, depending on what the writer is looking to express through their fantasy story, can be researched if the writer, deems it necessary and whatnot. But I just wanted to talk a little bit more about that. I hope that makes things a little more clear, that I think, generally speaking, says the one who doesn't have much experience writing fantasy at all, or much experience reading fantasy at all, that generally speaking, I think I get the impression that fantasy is largely environment based, and action based, what the characters are doing and exploring this environment. But I just wanted to make that a little more clear, or make that better understood, that apart from researching these environmental things and these props, that all the other research that may be necessary for other genres isn't so much present. And that's what I was initially thinking when I first started this story, that I wouldn't have to do so much research. But of course I ended up doing a fair amount, at least, for environment's sake. But anyway, getting back to this, this part right here, where I had put the end of the scene earlier up, but now I've brought it further down because I stopped recording and stopped writing at that part, and I stepped away from it, and I just felt like there needed to be more to it. And here's, you also see the more poetic language, the more poetic language going on here. I just got this feeling and this image in my brain of this part here, and I was wondering if I should write it like this. If I should put this part in the story at all, but I really felt like I had to go with my gut. Sometimes I feel that someone who creates, artist, writer, whatever, must go with their gut sometimes, and especially when you're writing, you gotta sometimes it's beneficial to let the characters tell the story for you. Sometimes you'll come across, something will spark, and inside you, and you'll see the character do or say something, and sometimes, of course, using the writer using their own judgment, their better judgment, sometimes I feel it's beneficial and makes the story more unique if the character is the one who inspires what happens next. Because this sort of thing, I just saw it, like, just the whole thing just happened all at once. Like, all these images just flashed into my head all at once, you know? I mean, maybe. I don't know if that makes any sense, but yeah. And I felt it was too unique and too unforgettable to pass up. So I needed to put it in the story. But I do enjoy the imagery of magma pumping through the knight's veins instead of blood. I like that imagery. And, you know, I felt pretty good when I was in the middle of writing this, but when I watched the recording back, I kind of felt it was kind of bad. But, you know, it's one of those things, as I've said before, probably use more time in revision to make it nice and neat and clean and more powerful. In these next couple of sentences, the syntax is kind of wrong. Since the subject in "the knight released her," that sentence is "the knight." The next sentence makes it sound like it's talking about the knight rolling onto her side and petting her throat, but really it's Aranthus. The syntax will have to change in order for that to make better sense, because sentences within a paragraph must flow logically into one another. But that's all I have time for in part 15. Thank you.